Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for the Arts. First, I'd like to acknowledge that our visiting artist programs are made possible through generous support from the Rosina and Dean Carter Fund and the Carol and C.Y. Davis Fund. I'm Brian Holcomb, Director of Visual Arts, and today we're joined by artist Brian Dettmer, whose new commission, Memories of the Mountains, transforms literary archives into a sculptural landscape. Brian is internationally recognized for his sculptural transformations of books, works that reveal hidden layers of meaning through the meticulous process of carving, cutting, and reconfiguring printed matter. Originally trained in graphic design, his practice bridges language and image, craftsmanship and concept, and material and memory. His work has been exhibited at institutions such as the Museum of Art and Design in New York, Smithsonian American Art Museum, Renwick Gallery, and the High Museum of Art, and is held in permanent collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Yale University Art Gallery, and others. And he has given talks at the Victoria and Albright Museum, the New York Public Library, and TED Youth, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Wired magazine. Dettmer joins us today to discuss his new commission for the Grand Lobby, Memories of the Mountains, created from bound volumes of the Virginia Quarterly Review. The sculptural mural transforms 39 books, each containing 4 literary journals spanning from 1927 to 1974, creating a undulating mountainscape inspired by our surrounding landscape. In conjunction with the commission, we're also presenting The First to Pass Through, another Dettmer's major works composed of 2 full sets of mid-century children's encyclopedias woven together in circular formation to evoke a clock, a mandala. Together, these works invite us to reflect how knowledge endures and transforms. Please join me in welcoming Brian Dettmer. So I wanted to begin talking today about how all these ideas, or how the commission came together for Memories of the Mountain.
So Brian and I have known each other for quite a while now, and he contacted me about a year ago and asked if I'd be interested in doing a commission here at Virginia Tech. And of course I was excited about that idea, and I wanted to do something that connected to the local area, also sort of the mission or technology itself, and what some of the students here study beyond just art as we focus on. So I thought of different ways, different books that I could use, and I was gifted from I'm in the Chicagoland area, and Concordia University, which is just west of the city, had donated hundreds of books to me. Most of them are bound volumes of journals, magazines, or literary journals. And right when I was kind of brainstorming and looking for material, they had gifted me this series of 50 books, 39 that I used for this piece, that were the Virginia Quarterly Review. So each bound book in the piece itself has 4 copies of that literary journal. And I thought that was a good material to work with the idea of Virginia, the idea of the landscape, and the idea of information and text and history within the natural material, but also sort of this intervening technology kind of within the piece itself.
And you mentioned something too about, when you were selecting the books, they were like bound at different times. And so like one set had like green covers and the other set had darker covers. It's like how do you approach like dealing with the nature of the material, like its inherent appearance, and then coming together in this piece?
Right. Originally I wanted to name the piece Blue Ridge, but I realized I didn't have that many blue books in it, so it didn't really make sense for the piece itself. The university and a lot of libraries will bound magazines, and they'll do it, this was over a course of 50 years that they had bound these, so different librarians had worked on them. So there was, some of them were the green canvas, some of them were like a blue canvas. There were some burgundy ones that I left out, and then the more recent ones were the black leather canvas. So that sort of instantly made me think of the green as the landscape, and the black as more of sort of the bottom part, kind of more of an urban area. And you know, those, the way it's bound is one thing, but then of course the magazine interiors were what they were, which was mostly text within the piece.
And you said also you were thinking of your own family history when you were selecting these works, or when you were trying to figure out what it is that you were going to make?
Well, I was
for the
thinking of the mountains, and Brian and I both lived in Atlanta for, I was there for 8 years, and we worked together while we were there, and of course, that's when I first became familiar with the Blue Ridge Mountains and basically the South in general. But my family is from the Midwest, but both of my grandparents were from Kentucky and from some mountain areas, some of the Appalachian areas in Kentucky. And I wasn't able to find out too much about my own family history, but I have been to those areas and visited them. And so there's, with the title, Memories of the Mountains, it's sort of left open, like, is it my memories of the mountains, or is it the mountains' memories? Are they the memories of the mountains, or are they my memories of the mountains? So I like the idea that the mountains themselves, the information themselves, the books themselves have their own memories. And so I'm using my memories and pulling kind of those memories out of the material itself. And so there's a lot of stuff that's kind of general, kind of abstract, kind of random within the piece, but there's also a lot that's through other people's literature, other literary essays and everything that were within these journals. I was able to pull out sort of some personal stories and personal references in the piece as well. So it sort of ties to, you know, I feel like we have like almost a biological memory of the geography that our families come from, even if we're not necessarily from there specifically. And so there's kind of that history as well, and that idea of almost like forensic technology, where mountains themselves, rocks themselves, a piece of wood has that information within there that can be accessed through a different way, through an alternate way of accessing that information.
And also you're looking at the text itself, like you're basically reading the book too as you carve into it. I mean, I noticed it's like with in the detail in one of the images that it's above us right now, it's like I could see the memories of the mountains. The memories like included in there, and also too, it's like as you're choosing the words you've referenced, like concrete poetry and Dada in the past, but also the, you know, when you recognize the author's works, like on our tour earlier today, you were saying as you were carving through, you noticed essays that you actually had to go online to read because you became interested in it as you were carving through. Do you think of like the authors as collaborators when you're making this work?
I do. I think of whenever I'm working with either fiction or nonfiction, I think of the original illustrators, the original authors, the original bookmakers that brought together that combination or that curation of specific authors. So some of these literary journals will have different themes in them, and you could actually kind of feel that come out with the actual, you know, essays, but also sort of the clouds of words and the types of language that were used through the different years. The piece itself is also sort of a timeline going from 1927 to 1974 from left to right. And I was born in 1974 and 50 years old. And what was interesting, I think volume 1974 was volume 50, which was kind of a interesting coincidence. But then within that specific book itself, there were a lot of things that I tried to find that had personal meaning to me. But in a way, I'm taking these very specific essays, specific stories, poems, literature, and work from other people, and kind of, you know, literally dissecting them, cracking them open, breaking them down to essential elements so that they're kind of more like the experiences that we have every day when we're experiencing random events or just little things that we kind of put together in order to create a story, in order to make sense of that. So there's a lot of intent in there, but there's also a lot of randomness and a lot of openness in order for people to kind of bring their own personal stories into.
And how is your background and like you were trained as a graphic designer, you worked in graphic design, starting within signage. Um, uh, how is that, do you feel like it shaped your sensitivity to type, layout, and kind of systems of order?
Yeah, I studied fine art, but while I was in school, I worked at a sign shop and then continued working, making signs. And what I liked was that it was some graphic design, but it was nothing that was too creative, that was pulling that creative energy so that I, still had the energy to make paintings when I was at home. But I always had an X-Acto in my hand, kind of working with vinyl, and really made me think about looking at words and looking at text as imagery or as objects themselves. Because I was literally working with language as object. So I liked the idea that I was designing something and making something, but it wasn't really creative on its own. But there is something about sort of contemplating the physicality of language and also sort of that complete disconnection between the way language looks and appears and what it actually means. And so there's something with like the form of words, the form of language really has no connection to the actual content or the actual message it's displaying. But when I'm working into a book, that those words become physical, and that, of course, a book is the physical manifestation of language. So I think that's one of the things that kind of attracts me to it, is that connection between the concept and all the information that's already inside there, and the fact that it's sort of untapped or unrealized or inaccessible as long as it's not being read or used in a different way.
And so, how did you come to the actually working with the form of the book? And
So while I was in college, I had actually seen the work of Melissa J. Craig, who was at Columbia College in Chicago while I was there, Buzz Spector, some other artists that had worked with books, but I really hadn't seen too much book sculpture or sculptural work with books before I began working. And I was making collages with Braille and all sorts of like language systems, and ripping up newspapers, applying them to the surface of the canvas. And I liked that the information was actually there, but the more physical it became or the more immediate it became, the less literary it became, the less accessible it became in that way. So there was sort of that tension between the information that was there and the fact that it was no longer informative in a way. It was more of a tactile or physical or sensual experience. So as I was ripping up books, I was really feeling guilty about this. This was around 1999, 2000, and books were very much a part of our lives, even more so then than they are now. But I was thinking about the threat that books were under, but also the fact that they're mass-produced objects and there's thousands of copies of each one. And also the fact that information is sort of the raw material of today. So I was looking at the book spines. There's sort of these empty crusts as I was ripping up pages and feeling weird about using that as a material. And that made me look at the book itself as the actual material to work with. So the piece that you've put up there is from 2001. It was one of my very first book sculptures, and it's called Alternate Route to Knowledge. And actually had a roommate at the time that had cats, and was thinking about the way cats sort of scratch surfaces in order to use their sense of touch and their sense of smell and other senses that we don't use in the same way in order to gain information about the world around them. And so I just stacked up these books. These were actually construction catalogs for construction materials, and painted them all to have this generic look to them, and then kind of carved into the top of them. So I like the idea that in a gallery you would see it, you'd think it's just a stack of books, but as you get closer, you see this hole, this rough hole kind of dug into it. And it's kind of inviting you to want to touch it, to want to experience it. That idea of like, even if your job is to dig graves or dig holes for signposts or wherever, you're learning something, you're having an experience with that direct relationship with the material, but then also sort of this idea of learning through a more physical, experience.
And you refer to your process now as like extraction, like you're extracting the pages or you're extracting text, like digging into it, like it's a subtractive process.
Yeah, it's sort of a subtraction or an excavation. So whenever in any of my work I seal the book up, I seal the edges, and then I carve into it, and I don't know what I'm going to come across other than kind of knowing that the subject or the basic book design is something that's interesting to me. And so I want the book to kind of tell me what it wants to be. It sounds a little, hippie-ish, but in a way, it really is a collaboration between me and the existing material. And just like someone who might work with wood or stone, while I'm working, the book is kind of telling me what it wants to be. And of course, it already has a ton of meaning already inherent within the text itself. So for me, it's sort of a control or a lack of control that I enjoy, because I sort of set out these rules. I'm going to seal the edges to the piece, and I'm going to go one page at a time, and I'm literally just subtracting what I find. So within all of my work, everything's exactly where it's always been within the piece, and I kind of keep that strict set of rules in order to, I find like if I focus on that, I'm able to go deeper and kind of dive more into that type of creativity.
In one of your talks, you were like referring to the books as like a landscape in a way, and I just like moved to another piece where you were using the stacking to kind of build like the architectural foundation, for another piece that's kind of here you're out in our lobby, you're referencing like the mountainscapes, even though you kind of have the grid and the architecture of the books here. And the piece I'm like showing now is to the profile, but the front is kind of like more of a waterfall, just to how water erodes and creates valleys and landscapes. Like, how does like looking at nature and everything kind of inform your practice? Or when you're thinking of the book as a landscape, does that in a way kind of reveal a piece like the one we're looking at right now?
Yeah, I think within the structure of a book itself, it's very geometric, and the lines of the text and everything, it's very orderly. But when I think about language, it's very liquid and it's very flexible and fluid, and different like whatever language you use can mold to a different situation. And whether you're using art talk or talking as an engineer or just talking with your family, you're using different types of language, but the same words will have different meanings. So I do think of this kind of flowing, or this, excuse me, also this idea of erosion. And as we're reading through a book, we're literally sort of washing away the words as we're going. So it's kind of this eroding, but there's also this memory and this history, whether it's in a recorded form as a book or if it's just our memory ourselves. There's kind of this erosion and this wearing down through time. So I like to think about the book as almost a natural material, even though it's a cultural object, and think about what's happening digitally as information is eroding and manipulated in order to fit different formats. And some people think that books aren't necessarily as archival as digital archives, but we're constantly updating our digital archives, and they're constantly being lost. And their language is more flexible and more liquid, even because you can change it very easily within that format. But I think that's also sort of a dangerous thing, where we're seeing now, because we don't have the physicality, we don't have it's almost like the gold that backs up our dollar versus crypto. We have this physical object. We have we all have this knowledge we grew up with, sets of encyclopedias that we took for as fact, and we knew that history changes things, but you almost accept it as like an unchanging, almost an altar in a way, something that you can reference and have reverence for, knowing that that is the truth. And I think that as we lose the value of the book in our society, we also lose the potential for the value of truth, or the value of everybody having the same understanding. So I do think about erosion a lot. I'm like, water mudslides and kind of this liquid form or something that's not as tangible, washing away more of a solid material.
And you're talking about like how knowledge, and I mean the book is a carrier of knowledge, but how knowledge gets updated in a way, and I know you've also referenced the book as a body as well. Has that been some of the reasons why you've kind of gravitated to these reference books as information, like say we're looking at a medical anatomy book right now where you're kind of literally referencing those like 2 points of the book as a body just from the visual images, but then also medical history is always something that's constantly updated, which we can update digitally, but as the book it's stuck in that printed form.
Right. That's one of the reasons people that do go after me about destroying books is that this information is constantly changing. And if I'm working with a set of encyclopedias from the 1940s, the information about things is going to be very different than a set of encyclopedias now. So as we grew up, we always thought of the book as this constant source of unchanging knowledge, but there has always been that flexibility and always that change. So the subject of the book usually dictates to me how I want to approach it. So if I am working with a medical book, one of the metaphors I think of a lot is the book as a body or the book as a living thing. And I think it sort of is a living thing because it's something that has potential to grow in an infinite amount of directions. Any book does, even if the information is outdated. So when I'm working with medical books, I do really think of the book as an actual body. In a way, it's sort of a dissection or an autopsy, although I've never used that term myself. It's been kind of used online. But if I'm working with the book on geography, I do think about the book as geography or architecture. But one of the themes that I keep going back to is the idea of the book as a body. And of course, the book scale, the material, the experience we have with it is directly designed to relate to our bodies. And so, of course, most books are about the size of our head, for us to hold in our hands. And so they have been designed to adapt to our anatomy. But then, of course, when I'm working with books that are full of anatomy, it's interesting to kind of go back into. And, with this piece specifically, it has some of that erosion and some of those lines that kind of make it feel like wood or stone, but also looking at the anatomy within the book itself. So there's sort of a reflection of the process reflecting the content.
And also just to go to how sometimes people get upset, when you're taking these books and destroying. Most of these books were going to the dumpster, and actually even a way of recycling or upcycling them.
Right. For the most part, they are, and so it is literally a physically recycling or upcycling the material. So there is a bit of an environmental message in my work, but also the idea, for somebody to look at any type of material that's only used in a specific way that it was designed for, and to kind of question that and to look at, okay, well, what else could this bottle of water become? What else could something that's already been made become? So in a way, that's physically recycling. It's an environmental thing to use existing materials. People might be upset that I'm working with books, but again, like you said, that most of them are headed for dumpsters. If I ever find a book that's really rare, I'll either won't work with it or I'll find another copy to have in my own library, just so I'm a little bit more comfortable working with it, because I like illustrating the idea of loss. And I guess I'm participating in it a little bit, but I don't, all these things are things that were mass produced in the thousands. And I'm just taking, one edition or one copy of it in order to work with it and make something original.
And you're also working with other analog media, or at least in the past and everything, and because of technology gets outdated. So I'm showing it's like, and nobody's cried over your cassette tape use, right?
Right, right. Yeah, nobody really misses cassette tapes. I still use them, actually. I love cassettes. This piece is just one single cassette tape, and I was walking down the sidewalk and saw a dead bird, and I was trying to think of things to do with cassette tapes as I was with books, and I've worked with maps. Part of a larger conversation working with analog or physical materials that we used to use in our everyday lives that are no longer necessary because most things are digital. So this is just one single cassette tape, The Best of the Kinks, and it's about 4 inches by 6 inches, and using heat guns and knives and other materials, I basically sculpted this. And what's interesting is the exoskeleton of the cassette itself becomes the skeleton, and the feathers are sort of that living material. The music that flies through the air, of course, has deceased in this piece.
Yeah, and then another with your VHS tapes, another technology that we no longer have. But there's also kind of a sense of humor when it comes to approaching some of this work. The piece we're looking at was made from Goodfellas VHS tapes.
Yeah, it was 2 cassettes, if anyone's old enough to remember. When a movie's longer than 2 hours or 3 hours, it would be 2 VHS tapes. So Goodfellas was 2 VHS tapes, and this is just 2 tapes transformed. So, of course, the actual tape itself is the flowers, and the plastic material becomes the stems. And within my book work and the cassettes, with most of my work, I do like this idea that if I am going to kill something, I use the entire body. I use all the material. Just like if you were going to kill a buffalo, you use the meat, you wear the fur. You're showing a reverence for the fact that this is something that you're using to live off of. So, so there's sort of that ethical consideration, but also conceptual consideration that, now we have, like you had explained earlier, how some paintings were just transformed into sound. Mm-hmm. And, how when everything's ones and zeros, we can easily have an image that transforms into sound, or sounds that become image, or videos. Well, now with AI, it's all a completely different level. But I like the idea that just one object kind of can completely transform into something different.
And is there a reason why you just stopped working with this material? And you're mainly working with books. Are you working with any other materials besides books, or experimenting?
For the last 25 years, I was working with a lot of maps, which I've noticed a lot of other artists were actually working with maps at the time and have continued. And I try to look at other people's work in order to be inspired on what not to do. So if I see something that's already being done, I'll try to kind of go a different way and find that territory that hasn't been explored yet. I could always go back to the cassette tape. I feel like with the cassette tapes at the time I was doing them, people were still using them, and it was kind of on the cusp of them going extinct, and same with the VHS tapes. But I felt like there was more of a limitation on the metaphors and the different ways I could go with those materials. But with the book itself, it just feels limitless. And I think as the role of the book in our society has changed, and the way we access and put together information has changed, and the way we see truth has changed. So I feel like every year when I'm working with books, they kind of take on new meaning as our relationship with information has changed throughout the years. So I feel like that's sort of been the richest area to explore. But I have worked with other materials. Compact discs are sort of too shiny. It becomes a little bit too cheesy. I never really found a way to explore that. I've done some work with records and animation cells. Actually, I did quite a bit of work with animation cells. Again, another physical material that was handmade and had a lot of value, but is almost all done digitally now. So that's sort of, my main project is thinking about these physical materials that contain information or contain art that have like a new role, or thinking about, using them as metaphors for the way we obtain information now.
I wanted to ask you about, who are your artistic influences?
Well, it's good that you brought this piece up. This one is obviously, if you're familiar with Brancusi, this is inspired by his sculptures. He has a piece, Bird in Flight, and I think I called this Word in Flight, or I can't remember.
Words in Space?
Words
or-
in Space, that's right.
Yeah.
So he had Birds in Space was one of his
Yeah.
pieces as well. And so the form of this was influenced by his sculptures, also sort of influenced by like the idea of an elephant tusk or something that someone might gather or collect on some kind of old-fashioned expedition, where it's this idea of obtaining something, conquering it, and showing it off as a trophy. And so in a way, that's kind of a metaphor for our relationship with the way someone might read something, and depending on who it is, you might hear them reference that. You know, they almost, people will tend to display their knowledge as a trophy in a way. So Brancusi has been a sculptural inspiration. I think Duchamp, the way he looks at things, with that first piece, Alternate Route to Knowledge, I sometimes think of it as a reverse Duchamp toilet, because Duchamp took the toilet, put it in the gallery, it took something with no meaning, and it gave it a lot of meaning, and it made you consider what is art, how to look at that object. With that piece, I took something that was full of meaning, and I tried to extract all the meaning out of it, but of course it still has, takes on a new meaning in a way. Rauschenberg has always been a big influence of mine, the way he looks at materials and images in the world, and his ready-mades, Duchamp was his ready-mades, but his constructs and the way he would just sort of have no filter on the way he put things together, and the way he could really find great metaphors and great echoes and between different materials, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about his like cardboard series where he took cardboard boxes and kind of made these little birds and everything, but then he did take them a little further and then kind of create these trompe l'oeil sculptures from him using.
And then of course there's Joseph Cornell as well. I've been compared to, especially if I'm working with just one book and I'm carving that as a shadow box frame almost and finding the pieces within it. So I always liked Cornell's work, the way it's sort of, suggesting this almost infinite celestial world, but like with, contained within a little box, which is really what a book is.
And was that because there's just such a big collection at the Art Institute of Chicago? How you enter?
It might be because I grew up outside of Chicago, and I think going there, I grew up seeing that work, and Rauschenberg and Duchamp as well. But there might be some connection to that. There's also sort of a domestic, quality to his work that I sort of like. It's because it is in a box. It's sort of contained and it's clean. Because art can be messy and life can be messy. So there's something about that. Control, but then within the piece itself, there's that tension. So I feel like there's that tension within my work, that control and lack of control at the same time.
And what about fellow artists who work with books?
As I mentioned, Buzz Spector before, he has been working with books since the 70s, and he was in Chicago at the time as well. So I think that was sort of the first book sculpture I saw, and he would take books and really sort of a conceptual practice, a metaphor for erasure and loss of memory as well, and kind of rip each page so that you end up getting these undulating kind of ripples of, from every single page. And just seeing a ripped book, like when you're in college, was sort of a profound thing at the time. And so I was familiar with his work, and Doug Bube is another artist that's been working with books for quite a while. And I think as I started working with books, I became more familiar with other artists that have worked with books over time, and tried to, carve out, pardon the pun, carve out my own niche into the territory that I find interesting to explore. But my work tends to be a little more obsessive maybe, and I do really enjoy that focus. It's almost like reading itself, where you're in this almost meditative, repetitive state, brought into a different world, just living in the moment. And but also I like the idea that if I am going to use someone else's art, someone else's material that has value to it, I feel like I need to put enough work into it in order to call it my own, and also in order to justify cutting up paperback books.
So I wanted to kind of talk about the process that kind of goes behind these. The fact is, like, just with the piece out in the lobby, this piece up here, I mean, these books do not get in these natural shapes themselves before you start carving into them. And there is a lot of engineering process, a lot of, like woodworking, because, paper is wood. So could you tell us like what the day in the life of the studio is like in the process of creating these elaborate pieces?
Yeah, sure. My father was an engineer, and my sister is an engineer, and so I think I have some of that in my DNA as well. And I originally wanted to be an architect before I went to college, and just slowly realized that I had to be an artist and had to be able to explore things and push them in their own way. But I'm constantly trying to find new ways to push the format of the book. So with any large piece, there's a lot of experimenting. The piece that's out there, Memories of the Mountains, the large landscape, I was trying to figure out different ways of configuring the books, but then there's the actual engineering and the construction of the piece itself in order to get it to really pushing something that wasn't designed to be that way. So I think even within the construction process photos that I take, there's a lot of metaphors for the idea that the books are being clamped shut or held down or weighted down. A lot of times I'll take a photo like that and think that should just be a finished piece on its own. And I suppose somebody with a little bit more discipline might just let it be. But I, of course, have to continue to push it further. But I'm constantly working with weights and clamps and ropes, and sometimes things are hanging from the ceiling if I have them drying, but I don't want the bottom to, so it's kind of the fun in it. And a lot of times I'll experiment and push something a little bit too far, but I want there to be a balance. I always want it to be recognizable still as a book, but I want to, push it enough to be my own work. So I'm constantly kind of playing with that balance between the two.
And the piece out in the lobby is 6 individual sections that were placed together to where it looks like one piece as well. So that took a lot of coordination with how they overlap to kind of make it seem like a seamless.
Right, yeah, that worked out pretty well. That was more just sort of a practical thing in order to be able to move the piece, but the piece out there is in 6 parts, and for a while I thought maybe just leave the spacing in between, but that was another way to, to make it, came together really well, the way it overlapped. But yeah, that was more of just practical. Probably definitely the largest by dimensions, the largest piece I've ever made.
And what are like the tools that you use for carving out?
So for the most part, I use X-Acto knives and tweezers, essentially. But I'll use Excel brand blades, because actually I'm using a different brand now, because they're a little less expensive, but I go through hundreds of blades like per week. But essentially I'll use some varnishes on the edge, thicker like modeling paste, and to keep the thing sealed, and then I'm carving in and removing one layer at a time. So I'll use X-Actos, tweezers, some surgical tools that I'll use to hold things down in place while I'm working. I've tried to use surgery knives, and it's kind of a great metaphor, but they're not really as sharp, because if you think about anybody that has paper scissors and fabric scissors at home, or if you think about the knives that you have in your kitchen, they're not sharp enough to cut paper necessarily. So it's what's interesting too is there's so many layers, but the book becomes really, really dense. So depending on the type of paper, I'll go through blades quicker or not. But sometimes the pages will kind of almost feel like they're melting together, as like one solid piece. And of course, that's sort of the layers of, almost like the rings of a tree.
And how long does it take you to typically create like one of these large, elaborate pieces?
The large, elaborate ones take a long time. Like something like this, or the piece outside, takes several months, because there's several weeks of kind of experimenting, figuring out what I want to do, figuring out what works physically, and then there'll be, the setup with like weights and clamps. And so if I have varnishes drying, that can take a couple days between each stage. But then once I start carving, it's, like any painter might have one large painting that they're focusing on for a couple weeks or a few months, but then you kind of get into it too much and you have to get away from it in order to see it with fresh eyes, and also just, you can get physically and mentally exhausted with one piece. So I usually have one large piece that I'm working on and a few small pieces at the same time. But something like this, which is actually at the 21st Century Museum and Hotel in Chicago right now, because it's in their collection and it's been going around. It was in Richmond for a while, a couple of years ago. But this piece is called Funk and Wag, and it's a full set of Funk and Wagnalls, and it's like 4 feet by almost 8 feet tall, and it's shaped like a large shield. So thinking about the book as almost an object from a natural history museum almost, something that wasn't created to be art on its own, but because of its historic and aesthetic value, it's treasured and displayed as art. So in this, it became almost a shield, and it's a way of sort of defending yourself with knowledge, but the books themselves are sort of defending themselves as well. Of course, there's also that tension, like it's a shield, but it's also being penetrated and being carved into. But that piece took like about 4 to 6 months probably, along with the next piece, the other piece out there.
That's 10-hour, 12-hour days.
Yeah, I'm pretty. I'm lucky to be an artist working in the studio full time. So I, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. That's what I usually do. And then when I had the studio in my house, I'd wake up at 4 in the morning and get 4 hours of work done. But I'm getting older now, and my kids are getting older too. So now I have a studio out of the house. So I'm pretty good about keeping the life and art separate, keeping the hours separate. But it's something I'm constantly working on, and usually definitely in the studio like 40 to 50 hours a week.
Complete silence, podcast, or death metal?
all of the above, actually. It depends on what I'm working on.
Yeah.
Actually, it's funny. When I'm working on setting things up and I'm thinking a lot, like in sort of the process stage, I listen to a lot of music, a lot of instrumental music, either electronic or post-rock or death metal. And then when I'm actually focusing, and we'll listen to like podcasts or books on, well, I guess I call them books on tape, but audio books. So too many, a lot of comedy podcasts, but too much politics lately.
So with the other work that's on display in the lobby, it's actually from 2015, so 10 years ago. First, the pass-through uses encyclopedias as its foundation, and what drew you to these two encyclopedia sets from 1961?
So these sets of, they're both children's encyclopedias, and they're from the 60s. So I think there was that combination of that, bright palette and sort of kind of funky illustrative style from the 60s and 70s. But it was 2 sets of children's encyclopedias, and I think with my kids growing, I was thinking about the books that they had been reading, and just kind of the fun and all the colors and everything. But there happened to be 4 books of the one set and 12 of the other, and the math worked out well. This piece becomes sort of it's a calendar in a way, and it's a clock in a way, and it kind of goes from left to right the way the books are actually organized. But it becomes sort of a roulette wheel as well.
And you said you did carving actually into this book. We were talking about it through the tour or earlier today about astrology signs or zodiac signs were in the outer leaves, which to me was unique for the work, because normally you're letting the piece more intuitively reveal itself, and this was more intention, like similar to with the cassette piece or the VHS piece. You were specifically creating a certain shape or form or symbol.
Right, like with the previous piece that you showed, that it's kind of a shield, and then before that, the Brancusi inspired piece is sort of a totem pole, and I've done other pieces that are kind of inspired by that. And then with this piece, of course, it became a mandala. But then I thought about the zodiac signs, also the Mayan calendar and the Aztec calendar and the Chinese zodiac, and just a lot of different circular formats that have been used in different cultures and different time periods. So I like the idea to suggest that, of course, the Mayan calendar was a functional object, it was a functional construction in order to understand our world. And so I like that I was incorporating all of these past cultural references within the piece. So the actual covers themselves I've etched into there. The zodiac signs, the Mayan calendar signs, the Chinese zodiac, all these different things that are kind of hidden in there. Of course, the more that I added, the less legible it becomes. So, and with my work, a lot, the subtraction is what's making it legible in a way, is, removing the noise, removing the excess in order to sort of distill something that's more interesting, or different, and more interesting for me. But this is also another way of, like, when you're piling more and more on, it becomes less legible. So, with Memories of the Mountains, also the large landscape out there, I'm also dealing with that tension between legibility or accessibility and inaccessibility in a way. So, the more that I added, the less legible it became. But I do, in general, like you said, I like this strict sort of sense that I'm not bringing my own information to the piece. I'm only removing things in order to find something new. And I guess technically I removed the pages rather than, because I never add any ink or any coloring to the piece itself. But finding this circular format, it just seemed like a perfect template to kind of play with so many different ideas from different cultures.
And final question before we open to the audience. What do you feel is the role of the book today?
Well, I think it's becoming more and more important. I don't know. It's sort of the last 20 years have kind of been interesting with the way the books become. And I think that we're relying less on books for information. I think most of my work, I'm working with nonfiction books, and I'm working with reference books that we don't use because the information is constantly changing, but also because, of course, digitally it's more accessible. But I can't remember who I just heard someone mention that basically our digital environment is as polluted as our natural environment was 100 years ago. Like we were talking about Impressionist paintings and how the fogginess is actually just the pollution. But everything right now digitally is just becoming worse and worse. And I feel like because of that, we have books, we have professionals, we have experts that we can rely on, and I feel like that's becoming more important than ever. And so I do think it's important that we value books, but I've said this before too. Not today, but as everything's becoming more and more digital, it kind of relieves the book of its day job. The book no longer has to function as the only conveyor of information. And so in a way, a lot of book designers, a lot of poets, book creators, other artists are looking at the book itself as almost a luxury item, Like if you're a record collector, you're doing that because you like the sound quality, but also you like the physicality of the record itself. And record designers have really pushed that even further than what just the typical record in the 70s or 80s was. And I think that's what's happening with books now. People that are making books are really considering the format and why their art or their story or whatever is best in book format. Digitally, I'll listen to an audiobook, and if it's something that's really interesting, everything is subscription based now too. So we don't even own our digital information. We just rent it. So it's becoming pushed by capitalism, essentially. We're gaining less and less control over our own ideas, but also over the information we own. So I still listen to CDs and cassette tapes sometimes too. I like the idea that I'm not going to have to continue subscribing to something. I don't have to continue to pay for something. And I know that is going to work 10 years from now. So you have a book, a paperback book from 200 years ago, and it's more accessible, more easy to read. That information's still there, and then you might have a digital file from 10, 20 years ago that is, just completely gone, and that's partially by design. So, there's that tension with books, but I feel like the role of books will always be important, and I think now more so that digital information is, very easily manipulated, and I think we can see that in the way we're, getting a lot of our information now.
Well, thank you, Brian. So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. If anybody would like to ask Brian something I missed. Savannah?
So with your process in these books, sources of knowledge, and using a subtractive process, it's almost like you're becoming kind of like an editor of sorts and shaping a narrative. So my question is, do you ever, how do you decide what to keep, what to remove, and like, do you ever feel any tension or, issues with what you want to keep or leave?
I do. In a way, I do try to think of myself almost like, okay, what if I'm approaching this as a machine and I want to just maximize the potential of everything I'm coming across? So I'll find, the most striking images or the most striking words. But of course, that only can go so far. And I always try to dodge away from sort of the easy route of, okay, here's a figure here, and that figure happens to is looking at that one. So it can be very easy for me to fall down this narrative path. But it is like an editing or a curation, or I also compare my work to like a DJ is taking someone else's work, making something new out of it, deciding which direction to push that in. So you can take one song and you can make it, ambient, or you can make it a dance hit. There's so many different ways that you can push the same material. So of course my own voice is always going to come into that. But so it's thousands and thousands of little decisions as I go. But like a blank canvas is such an overwhelming, there's an infinite amount of ways that it can go. So I like that I've kind of set up this game or set up these rules for myself. So I only can only respond to what's actually there. I can't, put something new in there. But as I'm going, some new story or some new truth about the book itself, I feel like, is kind of slowly emerging. And then I can decide which way I want to push that. So sometimes I'll work with a set of encyclopedias, and I create a piece that's structured off of geography. So within the images themselves, within the books themselves, I'll focus on images that reflect back on that shape or that idea of geography. But I could do the same thing with only political, or portraits of historical figures. So just even with, I've done some series where I work with the same book like 6 times in a row, and each piece becomes something different. And the first piece becomes sort of the obvious choices. And what's interesting is like around the third piece becomes more difficult, and then becomes easier towards the 6th piece. But the later ones become more interesting to me because I'm like dodging those obvious choices, not, trying not to repeat myself. And so I'm finding new ways to pull out something completely different that I wouldn't have necessarily found before. So they're almost like jazz variations on the same piece of music in a way.
Donald?
Fondness for material objects, namely books, etc., perhaps indirectly explains your transformation from graphic design to now sculpture. But regarding the commission piece in particular, I can appreciate the profile and suggesting the mountains, and in fact even the underside of it suggesting perhaps geology. Where it's located, I question whether there's really, and particularly as a flatlander, whether there's really content regarding people of Appalachia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, etc. And I wonder if instead if the excavation is really a chance operation.
Well, there's of course a lot of chance within the piece itself, and the original Virginia Quarterly Review is a literary journal with poetry, short stories, essays, and other stories from authors all around Virginia, around the South, but around the world, of course. So it's from a sort of a geographic perspective of the entire world. So there is, of course, a lot of randomness and a lot of chance within the piece. And I tried to find things that related to my own personal story. There were some information about, specifically about the Appalachian Mountains, and some work and poetry that specifically came out of this region, and then a lot that didn't, of course. So one of the sort of juxtapositions or tensions in the piece too, of course, is the natural geography, and then sort of the technology, the landscape below is almost like a cityscape. So in a way, it's sort of Virginia and then the tech, which I thought about, but it also kind of feels like piano keys. That's of course a simplistic way to describe it, but there's sort of a musicality to it as well. So I didn't try to, I wanted to work with something that referenced Virginia and the format, but within the text and the content itself, you're right that I didn't specifically focus in and only on people in the mountainous area. And I did find some books that might have been more specific or more relevant to that, and that can kind of be it can be a difficult subject as well, because a lot of the writing and the imagery that comes from the region isn't necessarily casting the best light on the history of the people from the area. And I think that there's such a rich history, people looking down on certain people from certain communities, but then there's also such a rich literary history that has arisen from this area and from every area, really. So I wanted to kind of have that tension between the local specificity and the sort of universal text that comes out of that. So I think within the piece itself, what is it it's not necessarily about anything specifically that I'm trying to say, but I want to show that tension between the natural and the man-made, that tension between the mountains and the city, that tension between different levels of education. That's something I also try to work with is within my pieces. I want somebody from a local kindergarten or somebody with a PhD in media theory to be able to look at my work and for everybody to enjoy it and take something different out of the piece itself. So in a way, it's like literature itself. You can write something, but you can't really control how other people are going to interpret it necessarily.
I might suggest the book, The Man Who Made a Mountain.
Is it possible to hang that any lower so that the viewer can read the words?
We are at time. No, no, Joanna, we actually have to hang it that high in order to actually set up and entertain for all our multiple events here. This is why we're going to list on the website, bring your binoculars. No.
Well, I had actually thought about that when I was working, because I don't have the best eyesight. I never have. And it is high up and it's hard to read, and I kind of knew that while I was working. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is what part of my work is about, is that tension between something being accessible and inaccessible. And there can be sort of a frustration with that, because, well, just like with a closed book, you know that there's so much information, there's so much up there that can be appreciated, but it can never all be appreciated all at once. So I do think maybe we need, that'd be sort of a nice metaphor, looking at the landscaped piece with actual binoculars.
Yeah.
But I would need binoculars myself in order to.
But we fulfill the role of art challenging our audiences, and hanging is one of them. And I really want to thank everybody for coming today, and thank you, Brian.
Oh, thank you.
For the talk. We are at time, so I'm sorry, I don't have any time for questions, but Brian will be right outside, so if you have another question you wanted to ask him, or you just didn't want to present in front of a whole audience, please do. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.